It's an existential crisis plain to see. Democrats and Republicans believe our democracy is, quote, in danger of collapse.
But the reasons why could not be more different. This is Election 22, What Matters.
And it's not hyperbole to suggest right now democracy itself is on the ballot as well.
Fears of a crumbling democracy for reasons that could not be more different.
If we elect Carrie Lake, we are all screwed, just screwed.
I'm going to win the election and I will accept that result.
Hundreds of Republican candidates denying the outcome of the 2020 vote. Congress more divided than ever, and significant economic pain not slowing fast enough. Is our democracy collapsing?
This is episode 7 of a Washington Post Newsy special series, Election 22, What Matters? Now, from the Washington Post newsroom, Libby Casey and Andrew Rafferty.
This is not politics as usual. That's a quote from a professor at Emory University who says voter suppression should make us all afraid. Her argument, one of many, about why our democracy is in trouble.
Others point to the nearly 300 Republican candidates, that's more than half the field, who deny or question the outcomes of the 2020 presidential election. The Washington Post reporter who wrote that story will join us in just a moment.
And many of these candidates will win. The Washington Post found of the 291 Republican election-denying candidates on the ballot across the country, 171 are running in what are considered safe seats. 48 others running in tightly contested races. Some of these candidates who deny the outcome of the last election are slated to oversee the next election if they win. That's true in places like Indiana and Arizona, where Newsy's Alex Miller begins our reporting.
Recount, recount, recount.
The images of angry Trump voters out of Arizona on election night nearly 2 years ago were some of the most intense in the nation.
It was stolen, in my opinion.
And now as early voting begins for the 2022 midterm election, that intensity is still there.
I don't believe in early ballots. I don't believe in mail-in ballots. I need to be physically there.
Despite a so-called audit of the election results in the state and failed court challenges, it's still an issue Republican candidates up and down the ballot are running on.
Convincing people that their democracy is broken when it's not, and their elections don't work when they do, is an unforgivable lie.
Krista Rose led the first ever election integrity effort for Republicans in Arizona back in 2008 after concerns that some voters were wrongly getting turned away from the polls. He recruited and trained poll observers and made sure everything was on the up and up on Election Day.
It was very hard to find any takers because I think they rightly understood that we don't lose elections due to fraud in America. It's just not a thing that happens.
But this lifelong conservative knows he's in the minority in his state party. The Arizona Mirror reports the Republican National Committee is telling potential poll observers there are, quote, festering problems with how elections are run. The state's Republican Chair Kelly Ward tweeted earlier this year election departments are actively discriminating against America First Republican applicants. The candidates are following suit. U.S. Senate hopeful Blake Masters says Joe Biden is the legitimate president, though he accuses the FBI of government interference in the 2020 outcome without evidence. Former news anchor turned gubernatorial candidate Carrie Lake hasn't pledged to accept the election results if she loses. And Mark Fincham, who is running for the state's top election job, not only doesn't accept the 2020 results, but he hasn't committed to certifying a Democratic win in 2024 should it happen and he's in charge. His opponent, Adrian Fontes, isn't concerned about Republican candidates admitting they lost.
These liars have been elevated to personalities and as if their grievance has credibility, as if their lying matters. And the more we talk about it, the more it really matters. And it shouldn't matter. Cry about it. Don't concede. I don't care.
What he is concerned about is electing people to positions of power who won't follow the law.
Well, we saw these guardrails in 2020, whether it's the courts or specific people in power. Do you feel like those things will not hold in 2024?
I think what we have is sort of, along with that question, is this idea that democracy has problems in America and democracy is broken. That's not the case. Democracy is fine. But it was designed to work with people of integrity, people who are going to just do the job. It wasn't designed for charlatans and thieves like these folks.
The reality is the Secretary of State gig is one most voters on both sides typically overlook. People didn't pour money in or push endorsements. Not the case this year. Fontes is endorsed by Republican Congressman Adam Kinzinger and Congresswoman Liz Cheney.
I don't know that I have ever voted for a Democrat. But if I lived in Arizona now, I absolutely would. And for governor and for Secretary of State.
But even with help from Republicans, support for the former president is still lurking over Fontes' race and every other one on the ballot in Arizona this November.
And Fontes, for his perspective, says that he wants to expand language access on the ballots. He wants to see people who have served time be able to vote. And he wants to see voting actually expanded to people being able to vote on nights and weekends. I do want to note, though, that we did reach out to the Mark Fincham campaign to try to talk to him for this story. They did not respond to our request, Andrew.
Alex Miller reporting in Phoenix. Alex, thank you so much. We're going to continue this conversation in just a few minutes in our political roundtable. And this is what we alluded to just a few moments ago. A Quinnipiac University poll from late August finding remarkable consensus. 69% of Democrats and 69% of Republicans now believing American democracy is in danger of collapse.
Our next guest has promoted himself as a champion of election integrity. Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensberger, a Republican, has held that position since 2019, and he is on the ballot running for re-election against a Democrat who is critical of his time in office. His book, Integrity Counts, details his interactions with former President Trump and false claims of voter fraud in the 2020 election. Welcome, Secretary Raffensperger. So let's talk about SB 202, Georgia's voter law that's now in effect for this election. Democrats, civil rights groups, even heads of corporations have criticized it. One element of it, any Georgian can challenge the eligibility of an unlimited number of other people voting. Do you have concerns that that could lead to a witch hunt situation or aggression towards poll workers? Should that part of the law stand?
Well, people had that question in the debate, and what I said to them, first of all, we want to make sure that everyone is a lawful, eligible voter in Georgia. But that said, frivolous challenges just gum up the election works. And if I lived here in the state for 10 or 20 years and then I was challenged, I'd be offended also. So there does need to be some reform in that process. But what I want everyone to understand, this is not just in Georgia, but nearly nationwide. 11 to 13% of all people move every year. And in Georgia, with nearly 7.5 million active voters, what you're looking at is 800,000 Georgians that move in a year. So keeping and maintaining clean voter rolls is a challenge. And that's why the first thing I did in office was secure authority to join ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which now it's led by the states, and we have about 33 states that are members of that. And if you move to these states that are members, like Texas, Florida, South Carolina, Alabama, or Virginia, they'll notify us, and then we can begin to take off the voter rolls. So people have to understand how dynamic and mobile our society is. But also, I do think that the counties should be doing annual list maintenance once a year, and that would help us make sure we have clean voter rolls. But I do.
Sorry, Secretary, you're talking about clean voter rolls. That sounds like something that bureaucracy can sort of work through. But what we're also talking about is people being deputized to take matters into their own hands. So how are you concerned for people to be aggressive on election day, aggressive poll watchers there to make sure things run smoothly, but actually could intimidate voters?
Well, that's another issue. But going back to the challenges, we put out an official election bulletin, really giving the county guidelines on what they need to have a process in place. And those have been heard. Very few of them did go through at the end of the day. And I think that coming back next session, there should be a reform in that election bill that will be coming forward from our office.
I do want to go back to that Georgia voting law. One of the other big headlines from that was it took some of the authority away from the Secretary of State for you, and a lot of that was seen as retribution for what happened in 2020. If you win and you're successful, you'll be Secretary of State in 2024. Another name that might also be on the ballot that year is former President Donald Trump. So I'm wondering, under this new law, would you still have that same sort of authority? Would you be able to stand up to him the same way you did 2 years ago, knowing that you don't have as much authority under this new law as you did back then?
Well, I believe that, and I've been very clear about this from day one, I believe that the Secretary of State should be put back as the chair of the state election board. That way, then you have an elected official that's actually there instead of someone that's not accountable to anyone, and the authority is very diffuse. I think when having direct authority and reportable to the voters, and that's who I work for at the end of the day. I work for the voters. I think what I've shown is I'll stand up from election deniers from any place, any angle, any party, be it the 2018 or the 2020 results. I stand up and I stand for the voters to make sure we have honest elections for everyone.
Secretary Raffensperger, if election deniers are elected in other states, election deniers who are running for Secretary of State, the exact position that you hold, they could soon be in charge of overseeing their state's elections. What danger does that pose to election integrity?
Well, I'm focused in on Georgia, and I really, I know when I vote, and I would hope that most people when they vote, is they're really looking for the qualities of a person. Do they have integrity, character, honesty? And will they engage in civil discourse? And at all times, will they follow the law and follow the Constitution? We swear an oath to it. And it's not just words that you're saying. You're swearing an oath to the Constitution of the United States of America. But by doing that, what you're really doing is you're swearing an oath to be faithful to the people. And that's what all of us are called to do, whatever elected office we hold. And I'd encourage everyone to put those type of people in power.
Thank you so much, Brad Raffensperger, Secretary of State of Georgia. He's on the ballot running for re-election this November.
Thank you.
A quick break, and then our political roundtable, including the Washington Post reporter who is tracking hundreds of election-denying candidates across the country. You're watching Election 22, What Matters, a collaboration between the Washington Post and Newsy.
Americans will have to choose between the MAGA Republican platform, who have embraced extremism and the big lie, Democrats, independents, and mainstream Republicans who believe in the rule of law.
That's President Biden in late September framing the midterm election as a choice between preserving democracy and endangering it. And to some extent, Republicans agree that democracy is in peril, but for completely different reasons.
Well, I think number one, we need to impeach Joe Biden. Number two, we need to impeach Secretary Mayorkas. And number three, we should impeach Merrick Garland.
Let's dig in on what the country sees as the threats to democracy. Newsy political director Andrew Rafferty is back with us, as is Newsy's Alex Miller in Phoenix. Here in the nation's capital, the Washington Post's Amy Gardner. And in Milwaukee, WTMJ anchor and chief political reporter Charles Benson. Welcome to you all. Amy, you report that the implications of election deniers winning this fall will be lasting because they will hold power overseeing the next elections, and they will hold power in Congress. What could they do with that power?
A lot is the short answer. It also depends on the state. The rules vary by state, what powers executives have over elections and what they can do. For instance, in Nevada, if Jim Marchant wins the race for Secretary of State, he could immediately decertify all of the election machines in the state and cause chaos in the two largest counties where Las Vegas and Reno are. In Arizona, Kari Lake is running for governor. She has said that she believes that Katie Hobbs, her opponent, who is the current Secretary of State, should go to jail because she certified the results in 2020. So it really depends on the state, but there's a lot, even in states where the Secretary of State doesn't certify the results, there's a lot that those who are in charge of elections can do to set the rules, to encourage local governments to run their elections in certain ways, for instance, to hand count paper ballots, which has the potential to cause chaos in large communities across the country. So it really varies.
So are the election fraud fake claims and the people who make them more or less powerful than 2 years ago when these claims were first coming up?
That's a really good question. I honestly think that these claims are more pervasive today than they were 2 years ago. It's one of the things that we discovered, the team of reporters and editors at the Post who participated in our project on the January 6th attack, 2021. That moment was this culmination of former President Trump's false claims that the election had been rigged, but it was also a beginning in a way when the former president began to endorse candidates for the midterms and make election denialism effectively a litmus test. And so that's why you see a majority of Republican nominees for major offices around the country are in fact election deniers.
Alex, you're in Phoenix. What specifically do the Republican candidates in Arizona say they will do to prevent so-called fraudulent elections going forward?
Well, they have different plans based on the candidate, but they're all based on these election lies and conspiracy theories that ended up being unfounded in the courts. But when you look at Kari Lake, she's not a fan of early voting. She wants ballots to be counted by hand rather than by machine. And yet, at the same time, she says she wants the decision to be announced on election night, for us to know who the winners are on election night. But if you talk to any elections experts, they say that would just take a lot longer not to use those machine counting, not to have early voting. And when you look at Blake Masters, the Senate candidate, he doesn't have really detailed plans, but he's in favor of nationwide voter IDs. But the person that a lot of people here in Arizona are paying attention to is Mark Finchem. He would be this top election official if elected as Secretary of State. He's also not a fan of early voting. He wants to severely restrict mail-in voting. And when he worked as a state legislator, he co-sponsored legislation that would have allowed the legislature to deny election results. And so when you look at all of these candidates, you can see that their plans are loosely based on the 2020 election.
Well, Charles, you're following Wisconsin's election closely. So the big election change there since 2020 is the banning of drop boxes. What has the reaction been from candidates and voters to this change?
So Democrats were really disappointed that they no longer had this option of the drop boxes, and it was the Republicans who really challenged this. And so they're excited that this law now is reflective of actually what Wisconsin law is. The issue with Wisconsin is that drop boxes were not part of the state statute, and so it got challenged at the Supreme Court level, and the conservative-leaning court ruled 4-3 that drop boxes cannot be used because they're not in the state law. How this is playing out in Wisconsin right now is in two different ways. The Secretary of State race is normally a sleepy race here in Wisconsin. It's a low-profile job, and it's been held by a Democrat for decades. This time, there is a more serious Republican challenge to the person who's held that job, and so it's sort of raised the profile of the Secretary of State job. The other place where it's being played out is in the governor's race. It's because right now there's a Democrat, Tony Evers, who's being challenged by Tim Michels, the Republican. And the thought process is if the Republican Tim Michels wins here with the Republican legislature and a Republican governor, changes can be made on how Wisconsin conducts its elections.
Well, Charles, your state is home to one of the biggest Senate races of this year. Trump ally Ron Johnson is fighting to keep his seat against Democratic challenger Mandela Barnes. Now, Johnson has repeatedly played down the significance of January 6th. Members of his staff even tried to give Vice President Pence a slate of fake electors. Are voters weighing his behavior as they make their choice?
I think voters have seen this story play out throughout the year. But when you look at the Marquette Law School poll, which is considered sort of the gold standard here in Wisconsin, when you measure what are important topics to Republican voters, they put it as inflation, crime, and gun violence. When you put this in front of Democrats, they look at the two big issues as abortion and gun violence. So while this issue is out there, when you look at the order of an importance, it has not played out as the top issue here in this U.S. Senate race.
Well, Andrew, Amy has reported about how election deniers around the country are running what could very well be successful campaigns this fall. So is there a disconnect, Andrew, between voters saying they're worried about the state of democracy versus who they are actually choosing to run our government?
Well, Olivia, I think there definitely is, and I think it comes down to this issue of threats to democracy and what those are, because those are defined very differently by members of different parties. For Republicans, a threat to democracy could be Joe Biden. It could be mail-in voting. So to think about it through the lens of just a threat to democracy as an election denier running elections, well, that's not always the case. And here's some really interesting numbers that came out this week from the New York Times and Siena poll. The question is views on candidates who reject 2020 results. You see a majority of the country, 55%, say they would not be comfortable with somebody who denied 2020 results actually getting their vote. But when you break it down by party, it's a little bit more insightful. So you see a big number of Republicans, of course, but 37% of independents, more than a third, are open to that, as well as a not insignificant amount of Democrats, 12%. And so when you think about how many House members voted to not certify the election, very few of them have faced electoral consequences. We expect most of them to be successful next month. And so the sort of repercussions for those who are in the eyes of some threats to democracy, well, it's not as clear-cut as it might seem.
All right, well, we appreciate the insight from Newsy's Alex Miller in Phoenix, the Washington Post's Amy Gardner, and in Milwaukee, WTMJ anchor and chief political reporter Charles Benson. Thanks to you all. Andrew and I will be back in just a moment with some of the most important races to watch on election night. Back now in our final moments with a look at how threats to our democracy will play out on election night.
Yeah, Libby, we'll highlight 3 races. This is happening all across the country, so it's hard to narrow it down but to just 3. But we'll start in Utah. This is actually one of the most surprising races, maybe of the entire year. Mike Lee, the incumbent Republican, facing off against Evan McMullin, an independent, somebody whose name might be familiar. He ran for president. And I want to play this exchange that these two had during a recent debate on the issue of January 6th, Mike Lee's involvement with the White House trying to overturn the election results.
And I think you knew how important it was when you sought to urge the White House that had lost an election to find fake electors to overturn the will of the people. Senator Lee, that was the most egregious betrayal of our nation's Constitution in its history by a U.S. Senator, I believe, and it will be your legacy.
Now, Mike Lee did vote to certify the election, but Evan McMullin certainly feels like there's a lot of moderates in that state who he can reach out to with that message. Another big one, Libby, New Hampshire's 1st congressional district. Chris Pappas, a Democrat, he is again on the hot seat. It's a position he's used to. He's facing off against Carolyn Leavitt, who is just 25 years old, worked for the Trump administration, got through a crowded and tough primary on the basis that 2020 election was stolen from Donald Trump, has been unwavering in her belief on that. And that obviously, Chris Pappas trying to make that a huge issue in that race as well. And then, of course, those Secretary of State's races, we'll highlight one in Nevada. It's one that Amy actually brought up. This is between an election denier, Jim Marchant, and the Democrat, Cisco Aguilar. Marchant has talked about making it easier for candidates to audit results. He's thrown out the idea of single-day voting, wants paper ballots, which actually isn't too radical. There's a lot of election experts who feel like paper ballots would get rid of some of these issues. Aguilar, he wants some of those, protect poll workers, more access to voting, a lot of those key Democratic talking points, beliefs on Election Day, those are central to his campaign.
So much of the focus has gone to the basic integrity of elections and denying the elections, but Brad Raffensberger made it through that Republican primary in Georgia against a Trump-supported candidate. In part because of some Democrats crossing over. Now he's facing a Democratic challenger in State Rep Bee Nguyen, and she's saying, look, he may not have sided with Trump, but he's still trying to curb voting and restrict voting through this latest election law in Georgia. Civil rights advocates are also concerned about the law, so we'll be watching that race as well.
Yeah, that SB 202 is coming up in every single governor, Senate, Secretary of State's race.
Well, thank you for joining us this week as the election quickly approaches. Next time, we'll look at the impact that President Biden will have on the vote and what the outcome will mean for his prospects in 2024. I'm Libby Casey.
And I'm Andrew Rafferty. Thank you for watching Election 22, What Matters? A collaboration between the Washington Post and Newsy. We'll see you next week.